Digital SAT versus the ACT, which test should you take? In this video, I am going to give you the rundown between the new digital SAT and the ACT exam. I'm going to talk about the similarities and differences of these tests, what people recommend sometimes take this test over that test, and give you the tools to make this decision yourself. My name is Brooke. I've been coaching both the ACT and the SAT for almost 2 decades. I scored perfectly on versions of the SAT and the ACT as an adult. I've coached students to perfect scores on both of these tests. We've had students score perfectly using our online ACT course also. And if you want private tutoring, we also offer that both with me and with our senior and junior level tutors. You can find more information about that at SupertutorTV.com/tutoring. So check all that stuff out. TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, X, find us there too. If you'd like to read instead of watch all of my tips here, we have a blog that goes with this video. You can find the link in the description below. Round 1, we're going to talk about time. Time is probably the most infamous difference between the SAT and the ACT. The SAT is a shorter test overall, now clocking in at 2 hours and 14 minutes of active testing time. The ACT is 41 more minutes of active testing, clocking in at 2 hours and 55 minutes. As you can see, the SAT has a reading and writing section that is broken into 2 modules. The ACT adds a science section and an English section, but know that there are English style questions also in the reading and writing section of the SAT. You can see that there are actually more math questions on the SAT than on the ACT, and the science section of the ACT is actually more of a reading comprehension section, but it has lots of graphs and charts. So if those drive you bonkers, maybe the SAT is a better fit. In any case, that's the basic rundown. SAT, you've got 134 minutes to finish 98 questions. The ACT, you've got 175 minutes to finish 215 questions. Who is the winner? In my mind, it's SAT. Who doesn't like shorter tests? Round 2, let's talk format. The digital SAT is offered only on a tablet or computer. The ACT, on the other hand, can be taken in some locations digitally on a computer, but most of the time it is given, at least in national test dates on Saturdays, it is given in a paper format. I personally love paper. I don't know about you. The digital SAT is adaptive. What that means is you're going to take 2 different sections, the reading section and the math section, but each section has 2 modules. Your performance on the first module in each section will determine whether you get the harder or the easier section for your second module in that subject domain. So in the reading, you start off with reading module 1. If you do well, and you miss, say, fewer than about 10 items, and it varies per test. It could be 10 items, it could be 12 items, and it depends on which items you miss because each one has a different point value. You will get shuttled to the harder section. If you don't do as well, you will get shuttled to an easier section. And if you get shuttled to that easier section, there is a max out on how many points you can get. And what I found from my testing is you can only max score get maybe a 620 to a 660 on any given digital SAT per section if you trigger that lower point section, even if you get a perfect on that second section. Again, the digital SAT is adaptive. The ACT, on the other hand, is just a regular old linear test. You take one section at a time and you just kind of roll through it. I will say that there are some studies in social science that show that students learn more deeply when they read on paper and they're able to focus better on paper and that they can work more quickly through reading passages. So even though the ACT is a faster test, I have found that some students just do better on paper. My colleagues that work in test prep, who I talk to about the digital SAT versus ACT debate and have students that have extra time and are ADD, swear by the ACT, in part because of this paper reason. And also because the ACT is such a time-sensitive test, you get extra time on that test. That test becomes much easier to tackle, right? And the fact that it's not adaptive and that it's just paper and straightforward, and it's easier to focus on paper for a lot of students than to focus on a screen. If you have trouble with focus, the ACT may be a better test for you, especially if you have accommodations. So who is the winner on format? I don't know. It's a toss-up. It depends on what you like. But I like paper. Character and content. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is kind of the vibe of the test, as well as section by section, what kind of content is on the test and are you responsible for? And if you have particular strengths and weaknesses, you might pay attention in this section. First, we're going to talk about the reading and science section. Why have I grouped those together? Well, on the SAT, the reading section includes science passages, and that's how it tests science. Though the science section is kind of its own unique beast on the ACT, it's a lot of graph and chart reading. The SAT in correlation has something called command of evidence quantitative questions that require you to read graphs and charts. This section is similar to the ACT science section in some ways, but it's not really a section, it's a question type, and it occurs only a few times per test. So you're just not going to be graph and chart reading as much. That's maybe a first differential between the tests. And I have some students who swear that they really hate and don't do well on the ACT science section. I have a student actually that I'm working with right now in the digital SAT, and the graph and chart questions still totally royally grill her because she just has trouble remembering to take stock of all the little details and read all the labels and just be really precise. It's just a challenging skill for her for whatever reason. And she does better on the digital SAT because the science section, man, she always bombed it. So always make sure you take a practice science section before you determine which test you want to take, but that's a pretty big difference. Second difference, and this is more of a character differential. I like to say that the SAT tends to be more of a test of nuance. To get questions right on the SAT, you have to choose the best answer of those available. Not the perfect answer, not this bell from heaven, ding, 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 oh, that's it, that's it, that's it. No, think of a dartboard. Guess what? Your SAT answer choices, none of them will be in the red center. They're all going to be somewhere on the dartboard. Maybe one is off the dartboard, maybe one's on the very edge of the dartboard, and then there's two others, and you have to determine which answer choice is what I call closest to perfect, not which one is perfect. So being able to determine, oh, this answer choice is a little bit better than this answer choice, that reading into the nuance, you have to be able to do that on the SAT to succeed. It's not going to be clear as a bell. And if you can manage nuance, you might perform better on the SAT than the ACT. Now, if that sounds like torture and you are a straightforward, what you see is what you get, whiffsy-wig kind of person, the ACT may be the test for you. The ACT generally, at least in the reading and science section, 97% of the time is very straightforward. If you find the right evidence, it will look like the answer choices. You have to paraphrase a little bit, you have to do a little bit of interpretation, but it's pretty, like if you find it, you got it. If you find it, you got it. And over again, it is a scavenger hunt. If you are a grinder, if you work hard, if you can work on upping your speed and your accuracy and your precision and grind this out, the ACT might be the right test for you. Also, difference in the reading section, the SAT is paragraph long passages only. The ACT has full page passages. So depending on your ability to focus, this is another reason why sometimes students with learning differences are better off with the ACT, because they have to just focus on one passage, and once they get that one passage, they can kind of work on all the questions. Versus on the SAT, you're constantly being asked to refocus on a new topic. And that constant channel changing in your brain of like new thing can be exhausting to some students who struggle with focus. So something to keep in mind. The other thing is the SAT reading level tends to be a little bit harder in terms of grade level. It could be 12th grade level or even college level, reading level. There's also poetry on the SAT, and some students do not like poetry. The ACT passages tend to be a little bit lower reading level, but they are longer. Still, that's something to keep in mind depending on how strong of a reader you are. Math. I like to call the ACT a final exam for every class you've ever taken or never taken, because if you've never had statistics, well, it's a final exam on that too. ACT covers a lot of different question types. There's a lot of breadth in terms of what kind of questions might show up on your ACT. The SAT has a smaller sample set of kinds of things it asks about. Once you master SAT math, you've mastered it. And because there are fewer types of items on the SAT, I find some students find it easier to study for the SAT math than for the ACT math section. That being said, the SAT tends to include some really challenging, abstract thinking, upper level advanced algebra questions. If algebra is your weak point, the SAT drills algebra like crazy. The ACT has a few more items in geometry and trigonometry, so if those are your strong math points, you might fare better on the ACT. The SAT on the math section also tends to reward clever thinkers and people who think in shortcuts. Additionally, the SAT allows you to use Desmos, so if you know how to, as I like to say, Desmos the crap out of questions, you might do well on the SAT. There you go. Math, which is better? It really depends on you and what you're working on. I say it's a tie. English, let's talk about the English. The ACT English section is hands down the easiest section on either of these tests to prep for. If that is your lowest score when you take practice tests to compare which should I take, definitely take the ACT because you can get that score up really easily. It's so straightforward. You learn the rules, you'll get the points. SAT, on the other hand, there are some more complex kind of grammar questions, particularly boundaries questions that have to do with phrasing and clauses and require really digging in and understanding the complex way that a sentence works, as well as the meaning of transition words and how those play into the punctuation that's appropriate. That level of precision on the SAT in grammar-related questions, which by the way show up in the reading section, the reading and writing section is basically reading and grammar, they can be harder for some students to broach. And my high scores, consistently, a lot of them are still struggling with how to use a colon, how to use a dash, which versus that, these kind of things. So it tends to be a little bit more challenging. If grammar is your nemesis, the ACT is probably the winner. I'm going to call ACT the winner on the English type of questions. Finally, a quick note on the essay. The ACT offers an optional essay. The SAT does not if you're taking a national test sitting, but if you take a school day test, you might have to take the essay depending on what state you live in and what your district's policy is toward that. So just a note, but the essay doesn't really matter for college admissions right now because it's not being given by the SAT. So it's sort of become a moot point in admissions and not really being considered much. So I wouldn't worry about it. High scores versus low scores. Next round. In the test prep community, there's sort of this belief among some of my colleagues that if you score a 1,000 or lower on your SAT, it is easier to prep for the ACT than the SAT because it's just a more straightforward test and it's a little bit easier to grind it out. The ACT has this reputation as sort of the grinder test, right? If you're the kind of student that can just work really hard and grind it out, that could be the test for you. Whereas the SAT has a little bit more of a reputation if you're a student who kind of just is a more abstract creative thinker, who thinks in shortcuts, who's always looking for the easy way to do a problem, the SAT might reward you more. In addition, I tend to work with extremely high scorers. Maybe it's my branding, but because I work with a lot of top students, we often lean SAT because most of my students want to be National Merit Scholars or National Merit Commended students. And in order to qualify for those programs, you have to take the PSAT and perform well on it. And why prep for two tests, the PSAT and the ACT, when you can basically prep for one? The PSAT is essentially the same test as the SAT, just with a little bit lower scoring range, maybe a few easier questions as opposed to hard questions, but it really comes down to the scoring, right? You can have hard questions on a PSAT and they just might not count for as many points, or you might not earn as many points for them, etc. So yeah, with my top scores, we tend to lean SAT, but it really just has to do with, we don't want to prep for two tests, we just want to prep for one, and all things being equal, let's just go for SAT, then we can knock out national merit and a test score for colleges. So who's the winner of this round? If you're a high scorer, it tends to be SAT. If you're a low scorer, it tends to be ACT, but that doesn't mean it's the full story for everyone. Final round. What's the best test for you? How do you determine that? The best way to determine it is take a practice SAT, take a practice ACT, and compare your scores. How do you do that? We have an awesome concordance table on our blog. What's a good PSAT score? We have a concordance table that we have custom created based on user percentiles and national percentiles to estimate if you took the PSAT sophomore year, what would be a correlated ACT that you take junior year, 6 months later when you're 6 months smarter? And does that correlate with what you got on your practice test? And if it doesn't, well, you can figure out which test you personally are stronger at. Now, if you're about equal, there's not a huge difference between the scores on your PSAT and your SAT, or your SAT and your ACT practice tests. It's up to you. Which test do you like better? Which test are you going to put in more time on? Because that's what matters the most. Your effort, your personal determination to improve and do better are what's going to dictate how well you do on these tests. It's about you, people. And if you like one better than the other, well, I say go for that. I hope you guys like this video. If so, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to our channel if you haven't yet. And check out SupertutorTV.com if you are looking to up your score even more. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see y'all soon.